Beneath the sands of modern Iraq, clay tablets have waited for over 4,000 years. Tablets that speak of a time before time, when beings called the Anunnaki descended from the heavens and shaped humanity from clay and divine essence. But these ancient scribes recorded something else, something that scholars have long overlooked. Hidden within the cuneiform symbols are references to human capacities that no longer exist. 3 senses that allowed our earliest ancestors to perceive realities we can no longer access. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we travel back through millennia to explore what these ancient texts reveal about who we once were and what was taken from us in the dawn of human history. There's somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Iraqi desert, the wind moves across dunes that have buried empires, and the silence stretches so complete that you can almost hear the centuries breathing beneath the sand. And if you were to walk here in the fading light of evening, moving westward from the modern city of Nasiriyah, you would eventually come upon a place where the earth rises in strange formations. And these are not natural hills, but the remains of something built by human hands thousands of years ago. And this is Uruk, the city that gave its name to Iraq itself, once home to more than 50,000 souls, the largest city on earth in its time. Now nothing but weathered brick and windswept desolation. And standing here, you might wonder how something so vast could have been so completely forgotten, how an entire civilization could simply vanish from human memory. And this is the mystery that begins our journey tonight. The mystery of Sumer, the first civilization, the people who invented writing, who built the first cities, who created the first legal codes, and who left behind clay tablets that would wait in the earth for 4,000 years before anyone could read them again. And when those tablets finally spoke to us again in the 19th century, they told stories that challenged everything we thought we knew about human origins. And tonight, as you settle into the darkness and let your breathing slow, we will explore what those tablets revealed and what they suggest about capacities that humanity may have lost long ago. But let us begin at the beginning in the year 1842, when a French diplomat named Paul-Émile Botta began digging in the hills near the city of Mosul, searching for the biblical city of Nineveh. And what he found instead was something far older, a palace buried beneath centuries of accumulated earth. And the walls of this palace were covered with inscriptions, strange wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay and stone that no one in the modern world could read. And at first, scholars dismissed these marks as mere decoration, perhaps religious symbols or artistic flourishes. But a few persistent researchers suspected otherwise, and among them was an Englishman named Henry Rawlinson, who had spent years copying inscriptions from a massive rock face at Behistun in Persia, risking his life on narrow ledges hundreds of feet above the ground to transcribe symbols that might hold the key to an ancient language. And Rawlinson noticed that the Behistun inscriptions contained the same text written in 3 different scripts, and if one of those scripts could be deciphered, the others might follow, and so began the painstaking work of cracking the code. Comparing patterns, counting repetitions, making educated guesses, and testing them against new discoveries. And slowly, over decades, the wedge-shaped marks began to yield their secrets, revealing not one lost language, but several. And beneath the Akkadian and the Babylonian lay something older still, a language unlike any other that had ever been discovered a language that scholars named Sumerian after the region where it had been spoken. And this was the first great surprise that the civilizations we thought we knew. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, were themselves inheritors of something far more ancient, and the Sumerians had been forgotten so completely that even the Babylonians who preserved their texts seemed uncertain about who they had been. And why should this matter to us tonight? Well, it matters because of what those Sumerian tablets contain. And to understand that, we must speak of the great libraries, and the greatest of these was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who reigned in the 7th century before the Common Era. And Ashurbanipal was a scholar king, obsessed with collecting every text he could find, and his agents traveled throughout Mesopotamia, copying tablets from temple archives and private collections, bringing them back to Nineveh, where they were organized and stored. And when archaeologists unearthed this library in the 19th century, they found nearly 30,000 tablets covering every subject imaginable, from medical treatments to astronomical observations, from legal codes to love poetry, from mathematical problems to creation myths. And many of these tablets were not original compositions, but copies of much older texts, some bearing scribal notes indicating that the originals were damaged or incomplete. And this tells us something crucial, that even in ancient times there was an awareness that certain texts were precious enough to preserve that knowledge from the distant past was worth copying again and again so that it would not be lost. And among the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library were texts that referenced the time before time, when the gods walked among humans, when the world was new and humanity was first created. And these texts bore names like Enuma Elish, which means when on high, and Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells of a king who sought eternal life and found only wisdom. And when scholars translated these texts, they discovered something remarkable. The stories they contained were older than the Bible, older than Homer, older than any written narrative that had survived in continuous human memory. And some of these stories would later appear in modified form in the Hebrew scriptures, the tale of a great flood, the creation of humanity from clay, the garden where the first humans lived. And this raised uncomfortable questions about influence and origin, about which stories came first and which were echoes of earlier tellings and beyond the famous narratives. The tablets contained other material equally fascinating, including king lists that traced royal succession back through tens of thousands of years, listing rulers who reigned for impossible periods of time. 8 kings who ruled for 241,200 years before a great flood swept over the land, and scholars have debated what to make of these numbers, whether they represent literal claims or symbolic meanings, or perhaps different systems of counting time. And the tablets also contain surprisingly accurate astronomical observations, predicting the movements of planets, calculating the length of the year, tracking the cycles of the moon with precision that would not be matched in Europe for millennia. And there are medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, some of which show genuine understanding of how the body works, and legal codes establishing principles of justice that still influence our laws today. And all of this matters because it establishes that these were not primitive people fantasizing about the sky, but a sophisticated civilization whose knowledge of the physical world was remarkably advanced And this raises a question: if they were so accurate about astronomy and medicine and mathematics, why should we assume they were simply inventing stories when they wrote about their origins? And the texts are quite specific about those origins, describing how humanity was created by beings called the Anunnaki, mixing divine essence with earthly clay to produce workers who would serve the gods and the tablets. Describe these beings in physical terms as having bodies that could eat and drink and sleep, as walking among humans and interacting with them directly. And whether we interpret these as literal descriptions or elaborate metaphors, they represent humanity's oldest written account of our own creation. And among the many themes in these texts, one stands out for our purposes. Tonight, a theme that appears again and again in different forms, the idea that humanity was created with certain limitations, deliberately imposed, that our ancestors once had capacities we no longer possess, and that these capacities were reduced or removed by the beings who made us. And this is what we will explore in the chapters ahead. But first, we must understand more about who these beings were and what the tablets say about their relationship with humanity. And so, let us turn now to the Anunnaki themselves, those who from heaven came to earth. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts, referring to a group of deities who played a central role in human affairs, and the name itself can be broken down into component parts, with An meaning heaven or sky, Una, Na, meaning descended or came down, and Ki meaning earth, so that the most literal translation would be something like those who from heaven descended to earth. And scholars have debated endlessly about what this name actually signifies, whether it simply means heavenly beings in a spiritual sense, or whether it carries implications of physical arrival from somewhere above and in the hierarchical structure of these divine beings. The tablets describe a ruling triad at the top: Anu, the father of the gods who remained in heaven; Enlil, the lord of the air and the earth who commanded the other gods; and Enki, also called Ea, the lord of wisdom, and the waters who would play the most crucial role in humanity's creation. And beneath these great powers were gathered 50 great gods and 300 lesser ones, forming a divine council that met to decide the fate of the cosmos. And the descriptions of these beings are striking in their physicality. They eat and drink. They argue and scheme. They feel pleasure and pain. They require shelter and sustenance. And in the earliest texts, they are described as performing labor themselves, digging the riverbeds and maintaining the irrigation channels that made agriculture possible in Mesopotamia. And this brings us to the Atrahasis epic, which tells the story of how humanity came to be created. And according to this text, the lesser gods, the Igigi, had grown tired of their endless toil, and they rose up in rebellion, refusing to continue their work. And this caused a crisis among the divine powers, because without labor, the world could not function, and the fields would not produce, and the gods themselves would suffer. And so the divine council gathered to find a solution. And it was Enki, the wise one, who proposed an answer. Let us create a creature, he suggested, who will bear the burden of the gods. Let us create a worker who will perform the labor so that the gods may rest. And the texts describe what happened next. In remarkable detail, how Enki worked together with the mother goddess Ninhursag to fashion a new being, mixing clay with the blood and flesh of a slain god, creating what the tablets call the Lulu Amelu, the mixed creature, the one made from divine and earthly substances, combined. And this word Lulu is significant because it suggests something experimental, something preliminary. And indeed, the texts describe several failed attempts before a viable human was produced. Beings that could not control their bodily functions or that lacked proper form. And only after many trials did the creation succeed. And this new creature, this human being, was designed specifically to serve the gods, performing the labor they no longer wished to do. And from the beginning, according to these texts, humanity was created with intentional limitations, made to be less than the gods who shaped us. Given enough intelligence to work, but not enough to challenge our creators. And the tablets speak of the divine essence that was placed within us. A spark of something sacred that gave us awareness and understanding. But this essence was diluted, mixed with clay bound into physical form, and thereby diminished. And some researchers have noted that the texts seem to describe an ongoing process of refinement, with humanity being adjusted multiple times over the early generations. And the most dramatic of these adjustments came with the Great Flood, which the Sumerian texts call the Deluge. And the story appears in multiple versions, with slight variations, but the core narrative remains consistent. The gods grew displeased with humanity, perhaps because humans had multiplied too greatly, or become too noisy, or according to some readings had developed in ways that the gods had not intended. And the divine council decided to destroy their creation to wipe the slate clean and begin again. But Enki, who had created humanity in the first place, could not bear to see his work completely destroyed. And so, he warned one righteous man in some versions, named Ziusudra in others, Utnapishtim, telling him to build a great boat and preserve the seeds of life. And when the floodwaters receded and humanity began again, the survivors were different, changed in ways the tablets hint at, but do not fully explain. And this is the context we need to understand as we move forward. For the tablets suggest that humanity was modified not once, but many times, that our current form is the result of deliberate intervention, and that capacities we once possessed may have been reduced or removed along the way, and among all the tablets recovered from Mesopotamian soil, certain texts stand apart. These are the tablets that speak not of kings and conquests, but of what humanity was before and what was taken from us. And to understand what we may have lost, we must explore the three perceptions that the ancient scribes describe the three ways of. Knowing that our ancestors possessed before the Anunnaki decided we knew too much. And the first of these, and perhaps the most profound, was the sense the tablets call the seeing without eyes, the capacity to perceive truth directly without the mediation of physical sight, and it is to this lost sense that we now turn our attention. And now we arrive at the heart of our journey tonight, the place where ancient text meets profound mystery, where the cuneiform symbols pressed into clay 4,000 years ago begin to whisper of capacities we can barely imagine. Three senses that the Sumerian scribes tell us once belonged to humanity before the Anunnaki reshaped our very nature. And the first of these lost perceptions, perhaps the most fundamental of all, is what we might translate as the seeing without eyes, and rendered in the ancient script through the symbol G-I, which carried meanings far beyond our simple word for sight. For I encompassed not merely the physical act of vision, but the deeper capacity to perceive, to know, to understand directly without the mediation of the senses we rely upon today. And when Sumerian scribes added compound elements to this root symbol, they created phrases that have puzzled translators for generations. Phrases that seem to describe a form of awareness that operated independently of the physical organs of sight. A knowing that arose from somewhere deeper than the eyes could reach, somewhere the ancients associated with the heart, with the core of being itself. The tablets discovered in the ruins of Nippur and Ur contain passages describing the earliest humans, those first beings shaped by Enki and Ninhursag in the creation chambers of the Abzu. And these passages speak of creatures who saw with the heart rather than with the eyes alone, who perceived the truth of things directly rather than piecing together reality from scattered sensory fragments the way we must today. And this description appears again and again in the oldest strata of Mesopotamian literature. This idea that original humanity possessed what we might call direct perception, an immediate apprehension of reality that required no interpretation, no analysis, no careful weighing of evidence, because the truth simply presented itself to awareness, whole and complete. When we encounter these passages, we must ask ourselves what such a capacity would actually feel like, what it would mean to move through the world perceiving not just surfaces, but essences, not just appearances, but intentions, not just the faces people present, but the truth of who they are and what they want. And the tablets suggest that this is precisely what early humanity experienced, a world without deception, because deception was impossible when everyone could see directly into the nature of everything around them. A world without misunderstanding, because understanding arose immediately and completely. A world where the barriers we take for granted between one consciousness and the reality it observes simply did not exist in the same way. The Sumerian concept of the me, those divine powers and civilizing forces that the gods possessed and sometimes shared, included among their number capacities for enhanced perception. And certain tablets describe how specific me related to seeing and knowing were carefully controlled by the divine council, parceled out to humanity in limited measure or withheld entirely. And this suggests that the capacity for direct perception was not merely a natural gift that faded over time, but something that was actively managed, deliberately calibrated, adjusted according to the wishes of those who had created humanity in the first place. And as we consider what this first sense might have been, what it might have felt like to possess it, we find ourselves drawn toward concepts that appear in traditions around the world, concepts that may represent distant memories of this original capacity, the third eye of Hindu and Buddhist tradition that perceives realities invisible to ordinary sight. The Ruach HaKodesh of Hebrew mysticism that represents a form of divine perception beyond normal knowing. The countless indigenous traditions that speak of seeing with the spirit rather than the eyes, of perceiving the truth of people and places and situations through a faculty that operates below or beyond ordinary consciousness. And these parallel concepts arising independently across cultures separated by vast distances of space and time suggest that something is being remembered, that some fragment of knowledge about this lost capacity has persisted in the collective memory of our species, even if we no longer fully understand what we are remembering. The tablets offer hints about why this sense may have been removed, why the Anunnaki would have chosen to limit humanity's capacity for direct perception. And these hints cluster around a consistent theme, the theme of humans knowing too much, advancing too quickly, becoming too aware of things that perhaps they were not meant to understand. And we see this theme echoed in the later Hebrew tradition of Eden, where the fruit of knowledge brings both awareness and exile, and in the Greek tradition of Prometheus, where the gift of divine fire comes at a terrible cost, as if cultures around the world retained some memory of a time when humanity's perceptual reach exceeded what the divine powers considered appropriate, when our capacity to see and know was deemed dangerous and was therefore curtailed. The divine council, whose deliberations are recorded in tablets like the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish, is depicted wrestling with the problem of humanity repeatedly, debating what to do about these creatures who seem always to be pressing against the boundaries established for them. And while much scholarly attention focuses on the council's decision to send the Great Flood, less noticed are the passages suggesting that the council's interventions included adjustments to human consciousness itself, alterations to the way humans perceived and processed reality, changes that left us diminished in ways we might not even be able to recognize because we have no memory of what we were before the changes were made. Some interpreters of these texts suggest that the veiling of human perception was not punitive, but protective, that the capacity for direct knowing carries burdens that limited beings cannot sustain, that seeing too much truth can overwhelm a consciousness not designed to contain it. And this interpretation finds support in the consistent association between expanded perception and danger in mythological traditions worldwide. The seer who goes mad, the prophet who suffers, the mystic who struggles to return to ordinary life after glimpsing realities beyond normal ken, as if the traditions themselves remember that this kind of knowing comes at a price that perhaps the Anunnaki were trying to spare us. And yet, something remains. Some echo of this first lost sense persists in human experience. Even now, in the phenomenon we call intuition, in the gut feeling that proves accurate despite having no rational basis, in the sense we sometimes have of knowing something we cannot possibly know through ordinary means, in the capacity that researchers have documented for humans to detect deception and danger and opportunity through channels that conscious awareness cannot identify. And modern neuroscience has begun mapping these unconscious perceptual systems, discovering that the brain processes vast amounts of information below the threshold of awareness, and sometimes delivers conclusions to consciousness through feelings and hunches and inexplicable certainties that prove remarkably accurate. The research on what psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer calls fast and frugal heuristics, and what Malcolm Gladwell popularized as thin slicing, reveals that humans can make startlingly accurate judgments about complex situations in fractions of seconds, drawing on information that we cannot consciously articulate, perceiving patterns and truths through some faculty that operates beneath or alongside our normal reasoning processes. And while scientists explain this through the lens of evolved cognitive mechanisms and unconscious pattern recognition, the Sumerian interpretation would suggest something different, would suggest that these capacities are not newly evolved but anciently retained, fragments of a much greater perceptual ability that was deliberately reduced but never entirely eliminated. As you rest in the quiet of this night, perhaps you can recall moments when you knew something you should not have been able to know, when you felt a certainty about a person or a situation that you could not explain or justify, but that proved correct. When some faculty within you that you could not name delivered information that your senses had not gathered and your reasoning had not produced. And in these moments, according to the ancient tablets, you may be experiencing a distant echo of humanity's first lost sense, a faint flicker of the seeing without eyes that our ancestors possessed before the Anunnaki decided we saw too much and drew a veil across our perception that has remained in place ever since. If the first sense allowed our ancestors to see without eyes, the second allowed them something equally remarkable, to hear without ears. And the tablets speak of this as the voice that travels without sound, a form of communication that our modern minds can barely imagine. So let us turn now to this second lost capacity, the sense the Sumerians called the speaking of minds. Before the Tower of Babel fell, before the languages of humanity were scattered and confused, the ancient texts speak of a time when all humans spoke with one voice. And while later traditions interpreted this as meaning a single shared language, the Sumerian sources suggest something far more profound, a form of communication that required no language at all, because meaning itself passed directly from mind to mind without the crude intermediary of sound and symbol. And this second sense, which we might render as the voice without sound, represented humanity's original capacity for what we would now call telepathic communion, the ability to transmit and receive thought and emotion and intention without any physical medium of exchange. The cuneiform tablets use several terms that seem to gesture toward this capacity, including variations built on the root Ka, which relates to mouth and speech and expression. And when scribes described communication between the earliest humans or between humans and the Anunnaki themselves, they often used phrases that do not quite fit our understanding of ordinary conversation. Phrases suggesting an exchange of meaning that happened directly and completely in ways that speech alone cannot achieve. And these textual hints point toward a mode of communication we can barely imagine, a way of being together in understanding that made the isolation we experience as normal utterly foreign to our ancestors. Consider for a moment what human society would be like if everyone could communicate directly through thought, if intention and meaning and emotion could pass between minds without the inevitable distortions of language, without the gaps between what we mean and what we manage to say and what others understand us to have said. And in such a world, deception would be nearly impossible, because you cannot lie with your thoughts the way you can with words. Misunderstanding would be rare, because meaning would arrive whole rather than being reconstructed imperfectly from symbols. And the fundamental loneliness of consciousness that we accept as inevitable, the unbridgeable gap between self and other, would simply not exist in the form we know it today. The Tower of Babel's story, which most people know from the Hebrew Bible, but which has much older Sumerian roots, describes a moment when this original mode of communication was deliberately disrupted. When the divine powers looked upon humanity, speaking with one voice and working together toward purposes that concerned them, and decided that this unity must be broken. And the text says that the languages were confused, that people could no longer understand one another. And while the surface meaning suggests a multiplication of spoken tongues, the deeper meaning may point to something more profound, the severing of humanity's capacity for direct mental communion, the imposition of barriers between minds that had previously flowed together in shared understanding. The tablets suggest that this intervention was motivated by fear Or something like fear, the divine council's concern that humans working together with perfect communication would be capable of achievements that the gods themselves had not anticipated and could not control. And the phrase that echoes through these accounts is "nothing will be impossible for them," which reveals that the Anunnaki perceived humanity's communicative unity not as a gift to be celebrated, but as a threat to be managed. And their solution was to fragment that unity, to install the barriers between minds that we now experience as natural and inevitable, to make each consciousness an island separated from every other by gulfs that can only be imperfectly bridged through the clumsy apparatus of language. And yet, fragments of this second sense persist in human experience, in the research on identical twins who seem to share knowledge they cannot have communicated through normal means, in the phenomenon of emotional contagion, where feelings spread through crowds in ways that cannot be explained by visual and auditory cues alone, in the experience that intimate partners often report of knowing what the other is thinking before any words are spoken, in the uncanny moments when you find yourself saying exactly what someone else was about to say, as if, for an instant, the barriers between your minds became permeable, and thought flowed between you the way the tablets suggest it once flowed continuously among all humans. Modern neuroscience offers its own perspective on these phenomena through the discovery of mirror neurons, brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action, creating a neural basis for empathy and emotional resonance, and perhaps for the sense we sometimes have of directly experiencing what another person is experiencing. And researchers studying nonverbal communication have documented that the vast majority of meaning in human interaction passes through channels other than words, through tone and posture and facial expression and timing, and countless subtle cues that we process below the level of conscious awareness. And some scientists have speculated about quantum mechanisms that might allow for correlations between minds, similar to the entanglement observed between particles, though this remains highly theoretical and far from established. What we can say with certainty is that humans retain a deep longing for the kind of connection that the tablets describe, a hunger for understanding and being understood that language can never quite satisfy, a sense that we are meant to be closer to one another than the barriers between our minds allow. And this longing may itself be an echo of the second lost sense, a memory carried not in our conscious minds, but in some deeper layer of our being, a memory of a time when communication was communion and understanding was instant, and the isolation of individual consciousness had not yet been imposed upon our kind. Two senses gone now, the seeing without eyes and the voice without sound. But the tablets speak of a third loss, one that the scribes seem to mourn most deeply. And this was not a sense directed outward toward others or the world, but inward toward time itself. And the ancients called it the long memory, and its loss may be why we experience existence so differently from our earliest ancestors. So let us explore this final and perhaps most mysterious of humanity's lost perceptions. Among the most puzzling documents recovered from ancient Mesopotamia is the Sumerian king list, a clay tablet that records the rulers of Sumer from the earliest times down to historical periods we can verify. And the puzzle lies in the lifespans attributed to their earliest kings, figures so enormous that modern scholars have largely dismissed them as mythological exaggeration or scribal error. kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, for hundreds of thousands of years in some versions, figures so far beyond our experience of human longevity that we cannot take them seriously as literal records of individual lives. And yet, the tablets present these numbers with the same matter-of-fact precision they use for later kings, whose reigns we can historically confirm, as if the ancient scribes saw no contradiction, no shift in category, between the age of impossible lifespans and the age of normal human duration. And here the tablets suggest something strange. They suggest that there was a time before the Great Flood when humans experienced time differently than we do now, when consciousness persisted in ways that our current experience cannot accommodate, when what we call a human life was not the bounded span from birth to death that we know, but something more fluid, more continuous, more connected to what came before and what would come after. And this third sense, which we might call the long memory or the temporal sense, represented humanity's capacity to experience time not as a one-way flow carrying us from past through present toward inevitable death, but as something more spacious, more accessible, more alive with connections that we can no longer perceive. The tablets describe early humans communicating with their ancestors, not through ritual or remembrance as we understand these things, but through direct contact, as if the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable in ways it no longer is. And they describe humans who remembered not just their own experiences, but the experiences of those who came before them, as if personal memory extended beyond the boundaries of personal existence into a vast reservoir of accumulated knowing that each generation could access and add to. And this suggests a form of consciousness so different from our own that we struggled to imagine what it would feel like, a sense of identity that was not confined to a single lifespan, but stretched across generations. A ye knowing that accumulated rather than being lost with each death. A continuity of awareness that made the past present and available rather than gone and irretrievable. When the tablets speak of decreasing lifespans after the flood, when they describe the long-lived patriarchs giving way to humans whose years we recognize as possible, we may be witnessing not a biological change, but a perceptual one. Not a reduction in how long bodies could survive, but a narrowing of how much time consciousness could encompass. And this would explain why the same scribes who recorded impossible lifespans before the flood recorded ordinary lifespans after it without any sense of contradiction, because they understood that what had changed was not longevity in the physical sense, but the breadth of temporal awareness, the range of time that a single consciousness could experience as present and accessible. Some interpreters suggest that this loss too was deliberate, that the Anunnaki determined that humans accumulating wisdom across millennia represented a threat similar to humans communicating telepathically and perceiving truth directly. That continuous temporal awareness allowed for the building of knowledge and power that the Divine Council wished to prevent. And so they imposed upon humanity what some tablets seem to call the mercy of forgetting, the gift of bounded existence, the limitation that makes each generation start nearly fresh, that makes hard-won wisdom die with the individuals who achieved it, that keeps humanity in a state of perpetual relearning, always progressing and always losing, and never able to fully build upon what came before, because the builders themselves are constantly passing beyond reach and taking their accumulated understanding with them. And perhaps there is mercy in this limitation. perhaps the burden of continuous memory, of experiencing not just your own losses and sorrows, but the losses and sorrows of all your ancestors, would be too much for a finite consciousness to bear. Perhaps the forgetting that comes with each new birth allows for innocence and hope, and the freedom to make new mistakes, rather than being paralyzed by the accumulated weight of all the mistakes that came before. And yet, the sense of loss persists. The sense that we are meant to remember more than we do, that our disconnection from the past is not natural but imposed. That somewhere within us, there is a capacity for temporal awareness that has been suppressed but not destroyed. We see echoes of this third sense in the phenomenon of déjà vu, that strange and universal experience of feeling that we have lived through a moment before, that the present is somehow also the past, that time has folded in on itself to bring us back to a place we have already been. And while neuroscience offers explanations involving memory processing errors and neural misfiring, the ancient interpretation would suggest something different, would suggest that déjà vu is a moment when the long memory stirs, when the veil across our temporal awareness becomes thin, and we glimpse for an instant the broader field of time that our ancestors inhabited continuously. We see it too in the research on children who report memories of previous lives, memories that in some cases have been verified to correspond with details of actual deceased persons that the children could not have learned through normal means, cases studied carefully by researchers like Ian Stevenson and more recently Jim Tucker, cases that challenge our assumptions about the boundaries of individual consciousness and suggest that memory may persist across what we consider the absolute barrier of death. And while these remain controversial and far from proven, they point toward a possibility that the tablets take for granted. The possibility that consciousness and memory are not as tightly bound to individual bodies and individual lifespans as we currently believe. And in the emerging science of epigenetics, which studies how experience can modify gene expression and how these modifications can be passed to offspring, we find a physical mechanism that might carry something like ancestral memory in the cells themselves, a way for the experiences of past generations to shape the biology and perhaps the consciousness of those who come after. And while this is far from the expansive temporal awareness the tablets describe, it suggests that the barrier between generations may be more permeable than we thought, that the past may reach into the present through channels we are only beginning to understand. As you drift deeper into the quiet of this night, consider the possibility that somewhere within you there is a capacity for remembering that extends beyond your own experience, a connection to those who came before that persists, even though the Anunnaki sought to sever it. And perhaps in sleep, when the conscious mind releases its grip, the long memory stirs, and the dreams that visit you carry traces of lives and times you consciously cannot recall, but unconsciously still carry, still remember, still know. 3 senses then that the tablets suggest we once possessed: the seeing without eyes, the voice without sound, the long memory, and together they would have made our ancestors' beings almost unrecognizable to us today, perceiving truth directly, communicating without words, experiencing time as a continuum rather than a succession of isolated moments. Beings for whom reality was immediate and connection was constant, and the past remained present and available rather than lost and irretrievable. And the tablets tell us that these capacities were not lost through accident or evolution, but were deliberately removed, deliberately reduced, deliberately veiled by the beings who had created humanity in the first place. The Anunnaki who looked upon what they had made and decided that we needed to be less than we were, that our perceptions needed to be narrowed, that our communion needed to be broken, that our temporal reach needed to be confined. But a question remains, one that the ancient scribes themselves seem to ask in the margins of their tablets and the spaces between their words. Why? Why would the Anunnaki remove these capacities? Why would they narrow the human experience so dramatically? Was it fear of what we might become, or mercy for what we might suffer? Or something else entirely that we cannot understand from our diminished vantage point? And perhaps, most importantly, did they remove these senses entirely, erasing them from human possibility forever? Or do they still sleep somewhere within us, dormant but not dead, waiting to be awakened, waiting for the moment when the veils might lift and we might once again perceive and connect and remember, as our most distant ancestors did, in the time before the Anunnaki decided that humanity knew too much? These are the questions we carry into our final chapters as the night deepens around you and the ancient tablets continue their patient whisper across the millennia. And so, we arrive at the question that has lingered beneath everything we have explored tonight. The question that the ancient scribes themselves seem to circle around without ever stating directly. The question that rises naturally from the clay tablets and their strange accounts of human creation and modification. Why? If these three senses were indeed part of our original design, if we once possessed the seeing without eyes, and the voice without sound, and the long memory that connected us to all of time, why would the Anunnaki remove them? Why would beings powerful enough to create us also choose to diminish us? And it is here, in this space of wondering, that we find not one answer, but several, each carrying its own weight, each offering its own uncomfortable wisdom. And perhaps the first and most obvious explanation is what we might call the control hypothesis. The straightforward recognition that workers who can perceive too much are difficult to manage, that servants who can read the intentions of their masters become unreliable servants, that a created species designed for labor in the gold mines and grain fields of ancient Mesopotamia would be far more useful if they could not see through the purposes of their creators. And there is textual support for this interpretation, scattered throughout the tablets, references to the divine council expressing concern when humans began to advance too quickly. The famous passage that echoes later in the Hebrew scriptures, where the gods look down and say, "Behold, they are becoming like us, knowing what we know, perceiving what we perceive, and this must not be allowed to continue." And we hear this same fear in the Tower of Babel account, which has its origins in these same Mesopotamian sources. The alarm at humans working together with one language and one mind, achieving things that threaten to blur the boundary between creator and created. And from this perspective, the removal of the three senses was simply practical, a management decision, a way of ensuring that the workers remained workers and the gods remained gods, that the hierarchy established in the beginning would persist, that humans would remain dependent on divine interpretation rather than perceiving truth directly for themselves. And yet, there is another reading of these same texts, one that is perhaps more generous to the Anunnaki and more troubling in its implications for us. And this is what we might call the mercy hypothesis. The possibility that full perception was not taken from us as punishment or control, but as protection, as a gift disguised as a loss. For consider what it would mean to truly perceive without filters, to see the intentions of every being around you, to hear the unspoken thoughts of those you love, to remember not just your own brief life, but the entire weight of ancestral experience stretching back through countless generations. This would not be a blessing, but a burden almost impossible to bear. Every interaction would become overwhelming as you perceived not just words, but the full spectrum of fear and desire and deception and longing beneath them. Every relationship would buckle under the weight of total transparency. Every moment would arrive carrying the accumulated sorrow and wisdom of all moments before it. And perhaps the Anunnaki looked upon their creation and saw beings drowning in perception, unable to function, unable to focus, unable to experience the simple mercy of a bounded present moment. And so they drew a veil across human consciousness, not to control us, but to free us, not to diminish us, but to give us room to breathe, to grow, to make mistakes without being crushed by the awareness of every mistake that came before. And in this reading, the 5 senses we retain are not a prison, but a garden, a protected space where we can develop at our own pace, sheltered from the full intensity of a reality we are not yet ready to perceive. And this leads us to a third possibility, what we might call the development hypothesis, which suggests that our current state of bounded consciousness is not permanent but developmental, not a final verdict but a temporary condition, that the Anunnaki did not remove our capacities forever, but rather placed them in a kind of dormancy, a sleep within a sleep, waiting for the time when humanity would be mature enough to handle them again. And there are hints of this in certain tablets, references to ages and cycles, to times of awakening that followed times of forgetting, to a cosmic rhythm in which consciousness expands and contracts like breath, like tides, like the great processional turning of the stars. And from this perspective, we are not fallen beings, mourning lost powers but developing beings moving through a necessary stage, like children who cannot yet handle the full responsibilities of adulthood, but who will grow into them in time. And perhaps the growing interest in consciousness expansion that we see in our own era, the meditation practices and contemplative traditions and psychedelic research and quantum theories of mind. Perhaps all of this is not accident but emergence, not novelty but remembering, humanity beginning to stir from a sleep that has lasted millennia, reaching toward capacities that were always ours, merely held in trust until we were ready to receive them again. And there is yet another interpretation, one that is perhaps the most unsettling, what we might call the experiment hypothesis, the possibility that humanity was never meant to be a finished product, but rather an ongoing research project, that the Anunnaki created us not as servants or children, but as variables, as subjects in an investigation whose purpose we cannot comprehend. And from this perspective, the removal of certain senses and the retention of others was not moral or practical, but methodological, an attempt to observe what would happen, how consciousness would develop under different conditions, whether beings with limited perception would evolve differently than those with full awareness, and the different batches of humanity referenced in some tablets. The pre-flood humans with their impossibly long lifespans, and the post-flood humans with our brief and bounded lives. These were not failures and corrections, but iterations, data points, variations introduced to see what patterns would emerge. And if this reading disturbs you, if it seems to reduce the sacred mystery of human existence to something clinical and cold, consider that even experiments can develop beyond their original parameters. That subjects can become something more than subjects, that whatever the Anunnaki intended for us at the beginning need not determine what we become in the end. And here we must acknowledge that the tablets themselves do not clearly favor any of these interpretations, that the ancient scribes wrote with an ambiguity that may have been deliberate, encoding their knowledge in ways that would reveal different meanings to different readers at different times. And perhaps this ambiguity is itself the message. The recognition that questions of this magnitude cannot be answered in simple declarative sentences. That the reason for our bounded consciousness may be multiple and layered, control and mercy, and development and experiment, all woven together into a reality more complex than any single explanation can capture. And perhaps we are meant to sit with this uncertainty, to hold the question without forcing an answer, to let the mystery remain mysterious. For there is a philosophical resonance in these ancient dilemmas that speaks directly to questions we are asking today, in an age when physicists propose that we may be living in a simulation, and neuroscientists probe the boundaries of consciousness and artificial intelligence. Researchers wonder what it means to create minds. We find ourselves confronting the same puzzles that the Sumerian scribes carved into clay. What are the ethics of creating conscious beings? What do creators owe their creations? Is bounded awareness a limitation or a gift? And if we discover that our consciousness has been deliberately constrained, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we rage against our makers? Do we accept the boundaries they have drawn? Do we seek to transcend them? Do we find peace within them? And perhaps the deepest wisdom of the tablets is simply that these questions matter, that asking them changes us even when we cannot answer them, that the act of contemplating our own consciousness is itself a kind of expansion, a small rebellion against the boundaries we have been given, a reaching towards something larger than our current perception can contain. And as you rest here in this quiet darkness, as the night settles around you and the weight of ancient mysteries presses gently on your thoughts, know that you are participating in something very old, that humans have been asking these questions for as long as humans have existed, looking up at the stars and wondering who made us and why, sensing that there is more to reality than our five senses reveal, reaching toward a wholeness that feels like memory rather than imagination. And whether the answers lie in clay tablets or quantum physics, or the silent spaces between your own heartbeats, the search itself is sacred. The wondering itself is a kind of awakening. The questions themselves may be the closest thing to answers that bounded beings like us can receive. And so we are left with questions that may have no answers, or answers that we are not yet ready to receive. But there is one final thread to follow tonight, one that leads not backward into ancient tablets, but forward into your own experience. For if these senses were indeed part of our original design, they may not be truly gone, they may simply be sleeping, waiting, and in our final chapter, we explore the tantalizing possibility that what was lost might yet be found, that the echoes of our original nature still sound in the depths of human experience, that the door the Anunnaki closed may not be locked forever. Consider for a moment the experiences that do not fit neatly into our understanding of bounded human consciousness. The moments that suggest our current perception may not tell the whole story. The times when you knew something without knowing how you knew it, when a certainty arrived in your awareness fully formed, without evidence, without reasoning, without any of the normal processes by which we claim to acquire knowledge. Perhaps it was a sense about a person you had just met, an immediate recognition of something true about them that later proved accurate. Perhaps it was a premonition about an event that had not yet occurred, a shadow of the future falling across your present awareness. Perhaps it was a dream so vivid and strange that it seemed less like imagination than like memory, a window into some other time or place that felt more real than the waking world you returned to. These experiences are so common that we have given them names: intuition and premonition and déjà vu and prophetic dreaming. But the names do not explain them. The names merely acknowledge that something is happening that our current model of consciousness cannot account for. And what if these experiences are not anomalies, but echoes, not glitches in bounded consciousness, but glimpses of capacities that were never fully removed? Moments when the veil grows thin and something of our original perception breaks through, the seeing without eyes flashing briefly into awareness, the long memory surfacing in dreams, the voice without sound connecting us to another mind for just an instant before the boundaries reassert themselves. And there is the phenomenon of profound connection. Those rare moments when you have felt truly and completely understood by another person, when the normal barriers of separate selfhood seem to dissolve, and you knew and were known in a way that transcended words. Lovers describe this, and mothers with their newborn children, and sometimes strangers who meet and recognize each other from nowhere. And perhaps these moments are more than metaphor. Perhaps they are functional telepathy. The second lost sense flickering back to life in conditions of emotional intensity. The voice without sound, finding a way through the silence that usually separates us. And as you lie here in the darkness, notice how the boundaries of your selfhood become softer, how the hard edges of your individual identity begin to blur as consciousness drifts towards sleep. This liminal space between waking and dreaming has been recognized by traditions around the world as a doorway, a threshold where other ways of knowing become accessible. The Tibetans developed elaborate practices for maintaining awareness across this threshold. The Greek oracles sought truth in the hypnagogic state. The shamanic traditions of every continent have mapped the territories that open when ordinary consciousness releases its grip. And perhaps this is not primitive superstition, but sophisticated recognition of capacities that our modern daylight minds have forgotten. Perhaps sleep itself is a nightly return to something older, a brief restoration of the consciousness we possessed before the narrowing. And there is growing scientific interest in these phenomena, research into psi and presentiment, and the anomalous effects of consciousness on random systems. Studies that suggest human awareness may not be as bounded as our models assume. That information may flow in directions and through channels that materialist neuroscience cannot explain. And while this research remains controversial, while mainstream science remains skeptical of anything that violates its assumptions about the nature of mind, the anomalies persist, the data accumulates, the questions refuse to go away, and perhaps we are living in a time of return, a time when the capacities that were dimmed are beginning to brighten again, when the sleep that the Anunnaki induced is finally beginning to lift. For there are references in some tablets to cycles of consciousness, to ages when humanity sleeps and ages when humanity wakes, to a great turning that brings back what was lost and opens what was closed. And the Sumerian cosmology was deeply cyclical, built on the recognition that what descends must rise, what is hidden must be revealed, what is forgotten must be remembered. And if we are indeed approaching such a turning, if the interest in meditation and consciousness expansion and spiritual awakening that characterizes our age is not random but prophetic, then perhaps the Anunnaki themselves will return, not as masters to check on their creation, but as witnesses to a graduation, beings who limited us for reasons we are only beginning to understand, returning to see what we have become in our bounded state, whether we have developed something in the crucible of limited consciousness that could not have emerged any other way. And what would restoration look like if the three senses were to return? Would it be gradual or sudden, individual or collective? Would we even recognize it when it happened? Perhaps it has already begun. Perhaps the very fact that you are listening to these words, contemplating these possibilities, opening yourself to these mysteries, is itself a sign of awakening, a first flutter of eyelids after a very long sleep. And as this night deepens around you, we leave these questions gently in your keeping. The tablets have spoken their ancient words. The mystery remains perhaps in the quiet hours ahead, in the space between waking and sleeping. You will sense something of what we have explored tonight. A flicker of the seeing without eyes, a whisper of the voice without sound, a drift into the long memory that connects you to all who came before. The Anunnaki may have narrowed our perception, but they could not erase it entirely. It is there, waiting, in the silence beneath thought, in the space between heartbeats, in the dreams that visit us when the conscious mind finally lets go. Sleep now if sleep is calling. The tablets will keep their secrets a little longer, and perhaps in the morning you will remember something that you did not know you had forgotten. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts soften and scatter like leaves on a gentle wind. The ancient ones are watching from somewhere beyond the stars, watching to see what their creation will become, and you are part of that becoming. Your consciousness a small flame in the vast darkness, flickering but not extinguished, bounded but still burning. And in that burning there is something that no limitation can fully contain, something that remembers a larger light, something that knows it was made for more than it can currently perceive. Rest now in that knowing. Rest in the mystery that holds you. Rest in the night that opens like a door onto dreams older than memory, and know that whatever was taken can be restored. Whatever was dimmed can be brightened. Whatever sleeps within you can still awaken. Good night. Good night. Good night.